I'm afraid to fly airplanes. I'm afraid that it will fall and there will be a disaster with the very plane in which I will be. A few years ago, my grandmother got sick, fell and fell. Without thinking twice, they sent her daughter and my mother, as one person, to take care of her, since it turned out that there was no one else. And so, after waiting for my vacation, I bought a train ticket to visit my mother, to southern Rostov-on-Don. Although my grandmother is sick and needs care, and my mother needs my help, I firmly decided that I, a child of northern snowy Kazakhstan, should plunge into the warm waters of the Don and the Sea of Azov. It took me 24 hours to get to Chelyabinsk, where I had to change trains to Rostov. The road was going well, lovely fellow travelers, a beautiful view from the window, and a mesmerizing sound of wheels. Having reached Chelyabinsk, I sat on the platform, since there was only an hour to wait and I didn't want to sweat in the station building, and ate chips, washed down with cola. I know it's unhealthy, but I really love these fried potato wedges. The train arrived without delay, and I entered the carriage. Having found my compartment, I greeted my fellow travelers and put my suitcase away. Before I had time to sit down, the guide came in and brought me bed linen. The conductor was a man of about 50, with an army bearing, and if instead of a railway uniform, he had been wearing a military uniform, I would not have been surprised. My fellow travelers took the opportunity to ask for tea, and I, deciding not to separate from the group, ordered it too. Less than 10 minutes had passed before I warmed my hands on a faceted glass and a carved glass holder with the symbols of Volgograd. The idyll of mighty drinking was interrupted by an obese woman in a knitted sweater and worn sweatpants. Darling, are you going deaf or something?" She yelled right in my ear. "Oh, sorry, I fell in love. The view is beautiful." I apologized guiltily. "She looks beautiful, might mimic me. Take the bedding." "They've already brought it to me," I answered my aunt. "How? Who? Why?" My aunt turned red with indignation, and I thought that another minute and she would burst. "The conductor brought it," I calmly answered, wanting to reassure my aunt. "Yeah, conductor. Who am I then?" My aunt was overwhelmed with emotions, and I couldn't understand why she was yelling like that. A man, about 50, in uniform, so gallant and polite. My compartment neighbor stood up for me. "He brought us tea." Yes. Such a handsome man. Another woman, who had previously read the book, spoke up. "Mikulik." Having calmed down a little, the aunt asked, "We don't know Mikulik, Sanich, Vasilik, Petrovich," continued the woman who was the first to stand up for me in a conversation with my aunt. "A man, and that's all. And if you don't work well, it's not our fault." The man brought somebody and checked our tickets. She pointed to the woman with the book. "He brought a bed for the girl over there. So, Mikulik." The aunt calmed down. Even the redness disappeared from her face. "We had a guide, Pyotr Mikulik. Good manual, there was no family. However, so he lived on the train. He was soulful. He loved his job. I just lived for her." The aunt wiped a tear from her cheek. "Why was there?" My second travel companion looked away from the book. "You talk about him like he's dead, by God. How could we talk about him otherwise?" The aunt was sincerely surprised. "He is the dead man. 3 months ago some drunken bastards threw him off a train. Only minced meat remained from our Pyotr Mikulik." The aunt wiped her face wet from tears with her jacket sleeve. "They buried him in a closed coffin, and since he lived on a train, that's how he works here. Life is his, and this carriage is my home." This happened 3 years ago. As I remember now, school, exams are just around the corner. I don't have time to do anything. I never liked the subway, maybe because of my grandfather, who worked there all his life as a driver. He often told the so-called stories that happened to him on working days under score. Maybe because of my frequent nightmares, I dreamed of shadows, who were always calling me somewhere. The time was already 10 minutes past 12. I stood on the platform, waiting for my train, hastily glancing at my watch. I wanted to be home as soon as possible, take a shower and go to bed. There were practically no people, only the old man sitting in the center of the hall and looking angrily in my direction, and the driver turning in his shift. Literally 5 minutes later, the train arrived. I hurriedly went in and sat down. In the carriage there was only a tipsy group of 3 people and a girl sitting at the end. It took me literally 4 stops to get home. I, putting on headphones, half asleeply glued to the phone, see a picture. One of the young men of a tipsy group began to make extraordinary advances towards the girl, to which she responded with absolute silence. But the guy turned out to be more persistent. Taking out the earplugs, I only heard the last thing he said to her: "What a dumb you are." The girl, without giving a sign, did not even turn in his direction, and the guy turned around and went back to his friends. I was enveloped in unreasonable anger. I never liked this attitude towards girls. I don't care even if you're drunk. I was about to get up, but the train stopped abruptly in the tunnel and interrupted me. We stood between. Realizing that we had not reached the station, I could barely see the platform, which didn't look like regular stations, but it wasn't abandoned either. There was a sharp whiff of cold, and I wasn't the only one who noticed. Getting up, the hero of this company headed to the doors. With a cry of "Look, what can I do?" he opened the door to the carriage. When he tried to get off, the train started moving. Suddenly the lights in the carriage turned off. We moved. I saw a silhouette on the platform that barely resembled a woman. The light turned on. The company laughed out loud, and only that guy looked at me with an unnatural, dead look. I instantly froze with fear, and then he said monotonously and clearly, "It's not you who needs to be afraid." After which, smiling, he jumped out of the car as fast as he could. When we had already arrived at the station, I saw that there was no one in the carriage except me and the remaining shocked two guys from that company. I still passed this station in the evening, almost with my eyes closed. Not even 2 hours into entering van life, I was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed off to my first destination, Idaho. I was traveling north from Utah, and it was a sweltering hot day in early June. The radio was blasting. My windows were down, shades were on, and I was feeling it. Cruising down the main highway with 2 lanes, I came to a random stoplight. Typically, you don't see traffic lights placed on a main highway, but thinking nothing of it, I braked and came to a stop. Once the light turned green, I pressed the gas pedal to, well, go, but nothing happened. The engine didn't rev, the van didn't move. The gas pedal felt like a floppy fish. People behind me started honking until they realized I wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. I was so baffled and caught off guard that all I could think to do was turn the engine on and off. The van was starting just fine, but the gas pedal did nothing. As the first flood of cars skirted around my van, I became increasingly worried at the second wave approaching within seconds. Even though I turned on my hazard lights, it was so bright outside that you could hardly see them. My van was sitting in the middle of a highway at a green light, taking up the full lane at a total stop. I was absolutely terrified I would be rear-ended or cause an accident. I turned my head and made eye contact with 2 men in a pickup truck who were in the turning lane next to me. I started rolling down my window, and they seemed to instantly understand I needed help. I got out of my van and yelled to them, "Can you tow my van?" They pulled their truck in front of my van into the intersection and quickly worked to chain the van to the back. I was trying to direct traffic away from my van in the meantime, and finally hopped in to steer while it was pulled off the road. They relocated my van safely onto the side of the road, and I gave them the biggest thank you possible. I felt incredibly lucky to have had such quick help and to have avoided an accident. From there, the rest was less eventful but still unpleasant. I sat in my sweltering oven of a van for the next almost 2 hours waiting for my insurance to send a tow truck. My van's AC is broken. From there, I was towed to a dealership 2 miles down the road. The good news was that since it was only 2 miles away, the tow lift distance was within my coverage, so it was free. The bad news was that it was a Saturday and the dealership wouldn't open until Monday, so I spent a couple nights at a motel down the street and explored all the beauty of this random town I was in. Ultimately, I never found out what caused the van's gas pedal to stop working. Our best theory is vapor lock because it was such a hot day, but by the time the dealership checked, The van worked just fine. It was, however, very low on oil. And I swear since that oil change, other little issues I'd noticed seemed to vanish. I know logically this doesn't make sense, but it's what I've observed. While breaking down on a highway was scary in one way, this next story was scary in a different kind of way. The most anxiety-inducing way because you're not sure of others' intentions. One evening I was exploring a northern city in Oregon without a camp spot in mind. As the sun lowered in the sky, I checked iOverlander for any nearby spots. Nothing, except one listing way off in the woods, about a half-hour drive from where I was. The vibes throughout Salem were not great. I felt sketched out and decided I'd head to that remote spot even though I didn't like how remote it looked. Nothing felt ideal at that point. Driving there felt like a bad scary movie scene. The roads got narrower, less maintained, and more enveloped by thick forest. The directions were telling me to go down what looked like someone's dirt driveway, which I did hesitantly while realizing the road opened up into a logging road. The road dramatically twisted and turned down a steep hill, pitching me into darkness, and this is where I lost cell phone service. The road eventually plopped me onto this main drag completely surrounded by thick forest on either side. At this point, the sun had set and it was very, very dark. I continued driving until I found the trailhead parking lot listed on iOverlander. There was a bathroom with bullet holes in the door of the women's restroom and one other car at the opposite end of the lot. I thought to myself, well, I kind of really hate this, but I just drove pretty far to get here and it's too late to look elsewhere. I settled in for the night, reassuring myself that darkness and lack of cell coverage didn't automatically mean murder death. But as I started drifting off to sleep around midnight, I heard the last thing I'd want to hear: a car pull in. I listened closely to evaluate with my ears as best as possible. I heard people walking, and then I heard glass smash. I heard voices loudly talking and lots of doors opening and closing. Then, I saw streaks of light pass through my window covers. That's when I got really freaked out. Over the next hour, I peeked through my window cover and watched, I think, 4 different guys walk back and forth behind my van. It seemed like they were constantly looking at my van because they were wearing headlamps that would shine through the window covers. They would yell, and one of them even started howling. One minute I'd think I was good because they'd walk into the woods, but then they'd circle back to their car and I'd get scared. I asked myself, Hillary, even if these guys head off into the woods for the night, will you be able to fall asleep? And I knew the answer was no. I needed to drive away, but I'd built it up so much in my head that I wondered, what if they followed me? But the final straw came after about 2 hours of listening to them yell and blast their bad music, because I heard gunshots. They'd gone into the woods to fire them, but once I realized they had guns, I lost any sense of safety provided by my van. So I waited for a brief moment where they'd all headed to the woods and booked it out of there at 2 a.m. I drove about 20 minutes back up the deathly steep hill and the winding roads and into a little town. I posted up at a small park and didn't care if I was kicked out at that point. There was a semi-truck there as well, so I figured I'd be good. That's when I learned to do a better job at trusting my instincts. The moment I had seen the listing of this place, I had uneasy feelings but wrote them off out of desperation. Never, never again. I'm going to combine 2 different incidents into one story because they happened so close together. While different experiences, they felt similar and related for some reason. And the first one is more just odd than anything. A few weeks ago, my BFF came to join me on the road. After spending a few days on the Oregon coast, we decided to head to one of my favorite camping spots in Oregon. We got a late start in the day, and by the time we arrived, it looked a lot creepier at night than I was hoping. I wanted to show her how cool the place was, but instead we pull up to a dusty spot in the woods where there's a big circle with a pentagram in the middle, drawn into the ground. There's a piece of a broomstick in the center of the pentagram. It was almost a full moon as the moonlight slivered through the treetops down on us. Definitely set a creepy vibe, but after talking about it, we decided to just turn our music up really loudly as we sat around the campfire. Part of me wants to say we ended up having a ghoulish experience that night, but nothing happened. I've also since learned that witchcraft isn't inherently creepy. In fact, it's a practice to become more connected with Earth. It's not something to be feared. but it did make another experience I had a few days later feel that much stranger. Wishing I knew more about human anatomy and bones, I try to Google human bones and match them to what I'm seeing. Nothing jumps out at me, but I decide I should alert local authorities anyways. So, I end up reporting it to police and they send 2 officers to the location. I meet them on the side of the highway and guide them through the maze of dirt roads. When it comes to van life horror stories, it doesn't get much worse than waking up to find a stranger in the van with you. It happened to us in the dead of night while traveling from Mexico. Palenque is the closest town to the famous Mayan ruins of the Palenque archaeological site and to the waterfalls of Misilha and Agua Azul. But beyond its proximity to some of Chiapas' stunning historical and natural attractions, the town itself doesn't have much to recommend it. A city yet to capitalize on the tourism market that flocks here to explore Chiapas, Palenque has a reputation as a dingy and somewhat dangerous town. In our limited experience, the reputation is unfortunately warranted. Arriving in the afternoon, we elected to explore the city on foot to discover the charm we were sure others must have missed. After a couple of laps of downtown, we had to concede there wasn't much here to attract tourists. We felt a bit uneasy about camping in the car right in the middle of town and decided to park nearby to the tourist district at the eastern end of the town center. After an expensive beer in a depressing tourist bar, we decided to turn in for the night, excited to leave for the Palenque ruins first thing in the morning. In a moment of madness, we decided to park and camp in an unlit section of a dark street, around the corner from the small tourist district. When looking for safe places to camp in cities, the general rule is the more lighting and visibility, the better. At the time, already feeling uneasy about the city, we thought if we were out of sight, we might be less likely to attract unwanted attention. A terrible decision in hindsight. Around midnight, as we were falling asleep to the sound of the rain outside, someone came past a car and tried to open the locked doors. I yelled loudly and jumped out of bed, pulling back the window covers, but couldn't see anyone on the darkened street. That event should have set off alarm bells and provided the motivation for us to seek out a safer place to camp for the night. But tired and sleepy, we reasoned that it was just an opportunistic local who had tried and failed to make an easy score. They would have no doubt heard my yells, realized someone was in the car, and wouldn't return. With that, we fell into an uneasy sleep. In the pitch black, I awoke to a sound I had never heard before and hoped to never hear again. Kelly's piercing, blood-curdling screams seemed to go on and on. "What's happening?" I mumbled foggily. "There's someone." In the car, Kelly cried, shaking me violently. "There's what?" I murmured, rubbing my eyes. "And now he's getting away," Kelly shrieked. Drowsy and struggling to find my bearings in the pitch black, I swung myself out of bed, fumbled for the door handle, wrenched open the door, and jumped out of the car. By the time I found myself on the dark, wet street, there was no one to be seen. I clambered back into the car. "What just happened?" I asked, now fully alert. "I woke up thinking you were whistling about and asked what you were doing," Kelly recounted, "but then I realized that you were fast asleep and the whistling was coming from the front seat. I looked up and I could just see the beady eyes of a man looking back at me. He must have only just realized we were in the car at that moment too, because he paused for a minute. That's when I started screaming and he took off." "Poor Kelly," I whispered to myself, stroking her fevered forehead. "She's had a terrible dream." "No, I haven't, you man. Check the front." Sure enough, the locked barrel on our passenger door had been removed and a handful of items the thief had managed to grab in his panic missing. Thankfully, he had only grabbed an old raincoat and a camera lens. We were able to replace the locked barrel some days later in Merida. It would be a bit longer before we slept through the night. We were delighted that my sister Isabel was coming to visit us in Mexico in November 2019. We had been exploring Oaxaca and were excited to show her some of the best spots we had uncovered. With only 10 days, we set a quick pace to fit in the mountains, beaches, ruins of Oaxaca, and the culture and food of Oaxaca City. Returning to Oaxaca City from the beautiful coastline, we discovered a shortcut that would shave an hour off our trip home. And having learned nothing from any of the other shortcuts we had ever taken in Latin America, we enthusiastically set off. As we turned off the main highway, the road quality immediately began to deteriorate as a potholed road took us past farms and small rural villages. As the houses became less frequent, things began to get really hairy. The paved road gave way to a gravel road, which eventually gave way to a dirt track. I stopped to survey my charts, Google Maps, and could see that the road would soon join up with a larger road where it would surely return to paved roads. Despite Kelly's anxious urging to double back the way we came, unwilling to face the truth, I plunged further on into the wilderness. The track continued to deteriorate, and we continued to bump along down the washed-out old GO track, refusing to accept defeat and drive back, humiliated, to the coastal highway. The two passengers begged me to turn around as the car bounced along, shaking loose anything and everything that wasn't held down. Eventually, we could go no further. Google had betrayed us and led us directly into a trap. The road, which was now single car width with large washouts on either side, ended in front of us at a large rushing river. There was nowhere to go but back. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough room to turn the car around. With no other option, I embarked on a 17-point turn to try to turn the vehicle around on the narrow track. Obviously, I couldn't. The car became stuck in the deep gutters at the edges of the narrow road. Now frantic, I leaped out of the car to check the damage. Realizing our situation, Kelly and I resigned ourselves to digging the car out. My sister exited the car and backed up to get a better vantage of how this was going to play out. With our rear wheels trapped in a large washout, leaving the rear bumper resting on the sand, I set about jacking up the car to try to fill in the washouts that had trapped the wheels. After jacking up the car, we were able to move some of the dirt, sand, and rocks trapping the wheels. But suddenly, as the car came free, it lurched forward, falling off the jack, which was precariously balanced on the uneven gravel road. Now, even more stuck, I continued to dig. After 10 minutes of wild digging in the dirt and sand, a bemused Mexican family came upon us, 3 hapless gringos. Kelly turned to the family and smiled ruefully, LS Loco gesturing to me and then to her own head to help them understand that I was an idiot and quite possible crazy. The family set about helping us free the car, and with their help, we were eventually free once more. I was able to complete my 17-point turn, and we were facing the right way. Finally free, we parted ways with our saviors, shoving pesos and some cold beers into their hands before setting off back toward the beach.
And he saw that behind the burning headlight, which on closer inspection resembled an eye, was hiding something dark, like smoke that had become dense and probably physically perceptible. The idiotic act of the young explorer became a good recipe, and from time to time those who were bolder and more reckless began to use it. Someone even tried to run closer to the train in this way in order to examine the mysterious creature. However, no one noticed anything other than what Sasha had already told. The train continued to disappear no closer than 5 meters before the man running towards him. Trackmen still sometimes disappeared and continued to disappear because of the train. But this happens very rarely, and the Metropolitan Management hides such cases. Who or what the train is, no one knows. Is this a ghost train? Or some mysterious ancient creature living underground? Where do the trackmen who come across the train's route go? There are many mysteries and questions. What do you think the tunnel something could be? One of my friends works in the metro, and it was he who told me this legend one day over a cup of beer. Subway workers, especially linemen, see a lot of strange and mysterious things. Huge rats no longer surprise anyone, nor do strange bloody scraps of clothing that are discovered every now and then. Sometimes they see ghosts in dungeons, but no one believes such stories for a long time, attributing them to the rich imagination of eyewitnesses. But something strange and inexplicable, quite creepy, is hidden in the oldest tunnels. You can see it between 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning, usually beyond the 200-meter mark. Ironic subway workers nicknamed this phenomenon the train, ridiculing this something in order to be less afraid of the unknown. And perhaps there is something to be afraid of. When the subway closes, trains stop running and the overhead rail is de-energized to allow linemen to move safely on the rails. Therefore, no trains move through the tunnels while the tunnel crews are working. However, more than once trackmen have seen how a bright headlight appears in the depths of the tunnel, very similar to the headlight of an old train or locomotive, emitting the characteristic noise of a moving train. Something is rapidly rushing towards people, forcing them to jump to the side from the rails. Anyone who hesitates without leaving the train's path disappears as if falling through the ground. Anyone who simply jumps off the tracks and presses himself against a wall or dives into a side branch of a tunnel often completely loses memory of what happened. Only if you step out of the train's path and close your eyes can you remember his appearance. However, of course, it is completely impossible to see where a delayed colleague has disappeared from the path. The trackmen found out all this empirically. Simply put, in each group of metro workers, one way or another, there were people who behaved differently when meeting something in the tunnel. Someone froze in fear in place and then disappeared without a trace. Some jumped away and closed their eyes, while others remained with their eyes open and saw everything that was happening, but lost their memory of it. In the course of discussions and conversations, it became clear how best to behave when meeting with the train. But there is another way to get rid of the trainer, preserving the memory of meeting him and remaining unharmed. This method was discovered by one young guy who, at the time of his encounter with the tunnel monster, had only been working in the subway for a month. It seems that the guy's name was Sasha, but no one remembers this anymore. He heard legends about the trainer, but did not believe them, mocking his colleagues. However, one day he also encountered this either a ghost or an incomprehensible creature. Seeing the headlights of an approaching train in the tunnel, the guy got scared and did something completely unexpected. He raised his flashlight above his head and with a wild cry, "I'll crush you," ran towards the train. The tunnel, something disappeared before reaching the young metro worker about 5 meters, as if it had become frightened. In the light of his flashlight, Sasha was even able to see the train. He retained the memory of this meeting and told his colleagues what he saw.